The gene editing aspect rears an ugly head in the fact that there are people now that want to grow clones, but also to edit those clones so that they would not have a brain. They would simply be what they have called organ sacs.
God is the creator of all human life and all science. Pro-abortionists like to paint the pro-life movement as based solely on a religious fervor, while they claim to have, quote, the science on their side. Science of embryology teaches us that from the earliest stages of development, the unborn are distinct, living, whole human beings. Human life begins at the very moment of fertilization. Welcome to Straight Talk on Life Issues. I'm Victor Nieves, president of Life Issues Institute. Today we're talking about science and human life with our friend Dr. Prentice. He's the president and founding board member of the Science Alliance for Life and Technology, SALT. He has almost 50 years of experience as a scientific researcher, a professor, academic leader, and policy advisor. Well, Dr. Prentice, as always, welcome back to the show. It is such a tremendous pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be back with you.
You know, Dr. Prentice, I'd love to start off today talking a little bit about the work that you're doing with SALT. People may have heard of it. It's the Science Alliance for Life and Technology. You're really doing some amazing work, and I think it's very pertinent to our conversation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we're a bunch of geeks, science geeks, and we've worked together in the past. Some of us have been doing this for 50 years, some of our more senior members like me. But people with decades of experience, not just doing science, being able to explain it to others. And we're seeing all these challenges come up, especially more recently, especially for nascent human life, which is what we focus on, the very earliest stages of human life. And we said, we kind of need to get together in an organized way. And so we formed the Science Alliance for Life and Technology, SALT. We've got our website at least started now and trying to season the debates with a little bit of truth about the science and ethics. So we've already done a congressional briefing just in the last couple of months, done a number of different interviews, including the podcast with you folks, and written articles, and trying just to help, especially the public, but also the policymakers, understand the value of every human life, how it should be protected and not used for spare parts, and what some of the science that is going on is, what we should be pursuing as an ethical type of treatment versus things that destroy human life.
You know, Dr. Prentice, there are many of us who are adamant defenders of the unborn who happen to also be religious. And there are those who would say that we've only arrived at that conclusion because of some sort of religious fervor, which, for the record, that is a perfectly good reason to be pro-life. But talk to us about the science, because even if you're not a member of a particular religious worldview, you can still be pro-life. Talk to us about the importance of the science in defending life.
And that's where we start. We want to focus on ethical science and trying to discern the good for the bad, the right for the wrong. I always get a chuckle because I think about at the March for Life, I've passed these folks with the big sign that says atheists for life. It's not a matter of having a particular religious fervor about it, but it's looking at the truth, the basic facts. And that basic fact is, as we've known and scientists have talked about for over 100 years, a human being's life begins at sperm-egg fusion. You don't just have a cell, you have an organism. And so we like to focus on what are the scientific facts, because that really gets down to the base that everybody should be able to understand. I've also talked about how human development, this is the most common experience for every human being, if you think about it, and we need to know what goes on in terms of those basic facts and how we can nurture and protect every human life.
The facts are the facts. One of the things that we often present to people when we're making the case for life or defending the unborn, within the foundation, I would say, of the pro life position are certain scientific truth statements. And one of the things that I think is very compelling for most people, and I'd be curious, Dr. Prentice, your thoughts on this, but we highlight the fact that from the moment of fertilization, the unborn baby is alive. And, there's a lot of ways that we could explain this, but just as a layperson, it's growing, it's developing, it's maturing. Immediately, it's replacing its own cells. In fact, as we've many times heard, about a 96% consensus when you send out these surveys and these questionnaires to biologists. And I want to point out that this is not just a group of Christian biologists. This is not just a group of overtly pro-life biologists. As much as I love the work of our pro-life OBGYNs and stuff, that's not who was responding to this. This went out to thousands and thousands of people. What can you tell us to those who somehow, some way, they look at the facts, because we're all dealing with the same reality. We're all dealing with the same evidence. We're all dealing with the same science here. How could somebody look at embryology and come to the conclusion that whatever you want to call it, we know it to be a baby, but that entity is not alive? I mean, I still hear people tell me that on a daily basis.
Yeah. And it's not a matter of looking at the facts and the science. In those cases where they would essentially deny those basic truths of biology, they have their own particular set of beliefs and desires, really. So if you look at whether they want to use that young embryo to harvest embryonic stem cells for research, which destroys the young life, whether they want to edit the genome of that young human being and do different experiments or try to come up with a better human being, the perfect baby, and so on. It's a matter of treating that human life, that human being, more as an object, whether it's for experimentation or to try and craft and model that young human life into something that they want, or, as we've seen with a lot of the abortion advocates, something that they want to reject. Denying that this is a human being, denying that this is a life, early on in development, nonetheless, it's still a human life. It's a matter of putting their own desires and wishes ahead of the actual facts and denying that truth.
And it's almost, to me, Dr. Prentice, I mean, this is almost like a pseudo-religion of its own. To deny all of these facts, I can't come up with an explanation for it other than what you just said. This is just a total denial of all of the science. I mean, I guess I'll ask it this way. Am I missing something? Are any of us missing something? Is there some sort of a scientific argument based purely on the facts and the observable information?
No, there's not. The biological facts remain the same. And those who focus on just the biological facts all agree and have, as I've mentioned, for over 100 years. You look in the embryology textbook and they will validate that same truth. Early stages of life have been categorized, if you will, into what are called the Carnegie stages for the first 8 weeks. And this was set in stone, if you will. And the scientist who is responsible for putting all that together, Ronan O'Rahilly, has made a statement that, prenatal life begins at fertilization and postnatal life begins at birth, but that's the same life. Look at the genome. That genome of that new individual, even at the single cell embryonic stage, is different than mom. This is not just an extension of her body. This is a new individual. The way mammals, including human beings, grow a new individual is by gestation inside a womb, but that doesn't change the nature of the individual involved. It's interesting, in fact, the honest scientists, if you ask them, and I can remember a hearing chaired by, at that point, Senator Brownback. A number of years ago, they had a number of scientists in there, and the topic was embryonic stem cells versus adult stem cells, which are better. Senator Brownback, at that point, made a very pointed question to a Harvard scientist who was on the panel, very esteemed and so on. And of course, they were arguing that we should use those young human beings, destroy them for the embryonic stem cells. They said, "Doctor, when did your life begin?" Not the generic, when does a life begin? When did your life begin? And being an honest scientist, had to say, at fertilization. So, again, this is not a matter of belief in that sort of esoteric sense. This is a matter of what the scientific and biological facts are.
Dr. Prentice, you touched on something very important there. Again, going back kind of to the foundation of the pro-life position, there are three scientific truths that we here at Life Issues Institute, we often point out. The first we mentioned is that from the moment of fertilization, the unborn baby is alive. We also have touched on the fact that it's human. You mentioned the genome. Well, if we look at the DNA, it's not like this is a giraffe in question. It's not like we're debating the efficacy of dolphin fetuses or something. This is a human being. Every strand of the DNA, and correct me if I'm wrong here, belongs to the species Homo sapiens, no different than the DNA, in my body or in yours. But one of the things that we'll often hear, even with those first two facts established, that it is alive and it is human, we'll hear, oh, well, so is your skin cell. Right? If you scratch your arm, you're going to kill a whole bunch of, human, and it is true, I suppose, to say that those are human cells, that they are alive in their own way. But you mentioned a key distinction there, and that is that the unborn baby is not like a skin cell. It's not like a gamete. It's not a part of another organism. It is a whole organism. It is a distinct organism, not the mother, not the father. It doesn't share the exact same DNA. Talk to us about the importance of that piece.
And it's a bedrock part of the science that term, and that's the term we like to use, it's an organism. Even at the 1 cell or the 10 cell stage or anywhere along that developmental continuum. And it's a continuum as well. Once you start, as you mentioned, there's a developmental trajectory. There's a pathway that this new individual has started on. And it's self-directed because the genome and the instructions also contained within the proteins within that new organism. It's not a fertilized egg, too. I kind of want to hit that one because that's a misnomer that a lot of people like to use. Oh, it's a fertilized egg. It's not really human. It's no longer an egg. The egg was fertilized at sperm-egg fusion, but it is now an organism. It has its own metabolic controls. It has its own developmental controls. And yeah, I've heard over the years a lot of times, well, it's a skin cell, that's human being too. It has the same gene. Well, no, it's not. It's not an organism. You can put skin cells into a womb or a womb-like environment till doomsday, and they will not develop into a full human being, an organism. They will continue to grow as stem cells.
Dr. Prentice, I'm going to spring a question on you here because you addressed something again, like always, that's so very important. You mentioned the continuum of human life, that we begin at the moment of fertilization, but life looks different as we get older. I often like to point out to people that there are certain things that I, as a healthy 26-year-old guy, I can do that a newborn cannot do. Just for the record, I can run a mile. A newborn might not be able to run a mile. Or same thing toward the end of our lives. There are certain things that we may not be able to do in the way that we could before. I say that all to address a point that I've heard from many pro-abortion advocates, and they'll say, well, at the very beginning, as they would say, the fertilized egg can be frozen. This new human being can be frozen in cryo storage. And they'll say, well, a human being can't be frozen. If they froze you, Dr. Prentice, you would just die. And they'll try and make the case that that means somehow the unborn baby is not also a human. With your understanding of the science and going so much more in depth, in this knowledge than most of us would have, what do you say to somebody who draws that objection and says, well, they can be frozen on day one? Does that mean that they're not a human being?
Not in the least. And it's a matter of freezing them. Number one, does not change the nature of that entity, that organism. Again, we'll stick with the biology, but that human being. And yeah, you're not going to be able to freeze me or you because we've got around 10 to 100 trillion cells versus a young embryo that even at a later stage when they still will freeze some of these might have 10 or 20 or 100 cells. That's simply a matter of biology and physics. And again, we would freeze cells that we had cultured in the lab and then thaw them out later and they would start to grow again. There was a critical aspect of that. You basically have to soak cells or an embryo, an early embryo that you're freezing, in what amounts to a type of antifreeze, different types of chemicals. And the point is you don't want ice crystals to form in the cells of this young human being. Why is that? Well, think about the size. An ice crystal to a 2-day-old embryo is going to be like a huge sword appearing within one of its cells, and it will kill those cells and kill that young human being. And so you add a little bit of different types of chemicals have been used. It prevents the ice crystals forming. The individual essentially is put in a suspended animation by putting them into this frozen chamber. And you really have to do it at very, very low temperatures to have the best type of preservation of the individual, liquid nitrogen temperatures and so on. But you're also doing this at a stage where there are very few cells in the individual. And that's why there becomes a better chance that we can thaw that young human being out versus trying to thaw you or me if we're dumped into a liquid nitrogen freezer. It doesn't always work even then because it's not 100% effective at getting that little antifreeze into all of the young person's cells. Used to be you had a 50-50 chance of surviving the thawing. Now it's better, maybe 75%, maybe even 80, but there's still a chance that didn't work. And it's because those are usually embryos that have more cells than the younger ones. And so it's hard to get the little protectant into them. But you don't change the nature of the organism, whether they're in the dish, whether they're in the freezer, or whether they're in the womb.
Dr. Prentice, changing gears a little bit here, I'm curious your insight in the work that you do with salt. How are some ways that you see modern scientific enterprises threatening to compromise, destroy either the sanctity of human life or just humans in general? What concerns do you see on the horizon?
And unfortunately, there are a lot that are cropping up and in the news lately. One is the idea, and I mentioned it before, that people want to make, quotes, better human beings or help you pick the best embryo. So IVF figures into all of this, and we've spent a lot of time studying that. That could take up a couple of shows of our time. But this is one where they're basically even advertising, a few companies now, that let us do a bunch of genetic tests on your IVF embryos, and we'll help you pick the best embryo. You know, you want one that's going to be smarter. You want one that might be able to run in the Olympics. You want certain hair color or whatever. Oh, we'll provide that and so on. Despite the fact that the science really isn't there and they can't deliver what they promised, he said they're already advertising this and even advertising the next step. You know, we might be able to do some gene editing on some of your embryos, and we will make them better. We'll add another gene that might make them faster or smarter or so on. Again, the science isn't there. And in fact, in the US, SALT folks were responsible for passing legislation a number of years ago that makes that illegal. But they still want to push this. And they're, again, pushing on people's desires. Who wouldn't want to have a smarter baby and help your kid along and so on? We hire tutors and we do all sorts of things with kids and give them piano lessons to try and help them become better people. Well, they're looking back at the embryonic stage now to do that. The gene editing aspect also rears an ugly head in the fact that there are people now that want to grow clones, and their cloning is still with us, and newer and in fact more dangerous forms, but also to edit those clones so that they would not have a brain. They would simply be what they have called organ sacs. So we will grow your clone so that then when you need an organ for transplant, we'll just go to the incubator where this non-entity is growing and we'll get the heart or we'll get the liver or whatever organ you might need. This is macabre. I don't know. Words fail in terms of the horror that we're talking about. But let's go back to an underlying principle that's really the existential problem here. The idea that some human beings are better than others or can be made better than others, and that in some cases they might not be human beings. The transhumanists and so on are the ones that want to make these non-entities, they would call them, as organ sacs. Every human being is valuable simply because they're a human being. And it relates to that developmental continuum where you start as a single cell and you end up with several trillion. You acquire different abilities along the way. Some are better at some things than others. You lose some abilities as we go on and age further, but it doesn't change our basic nature that we are a human being, a valuable entity.
Dr. Prentice, what you've just described should make the hair stand up on the back of everybody's neck. I mean, this is, I think maybe Orwellian is perhaps the best way to describe. This is horrific. It's shocking to think that our fellow human beings could concoct such evil in their head as to say we're going to clone somebody and we're going to use, oh my goodness, we're going to use it as an organ bag. That is absolutely horrific. To the point that you mentioned, however, when it comes to people doing genetic modification in the womb, to say, well, we're going to make, I don't know, maybe we want our kid to have blonde hair or something. Maybe it's something benign like that. Or maybe they want to have a performance, what they would consider some sort of a performance upgrade. There will be people who think, what's the harm in that? There will be people who think, it's maybe, let's say hypothetically, to grab from the plot line, I suppose, of Jurassic Park, let's say we can edit the genome to get around a certain disease, some sort of an ailment, some sort of an illness that a child has in the womb. Could we just change their DNA a little bit to maybe give them a long and healthy life? If we were to kind of steel man the other side's position, there may be those who say, well, what's the harm in that part? We've done a lot of great advancements scientifically. What's the harm in modifying the genetic code of a child in the womb? What do you see as kind of the long-term ramifications? What road are we going down?
Yeah, there's actually a threat to humanity in general in terms of this remaking human beings in our own image. And, we're not necessarily the best model in terms of being the designer, but this idea that you would do this kinds of genetic engineering at the very earliest stages is what's called heritable gene editing or heritable gene engineering, because if you do it that early, whatever modifications you make will be carried on and passed or inherited by future generation. And it sounds noble in some ways to say, oh, we want to prevent this disease from ever happening. We want to forestall any problems, not enhancement, just we're going to prevent the disease, not treat it. We're going to prevent it from ever happening. Wouldn't that be a great thing? Well, the problem is we don't really know what we're doing when we start fiddling with the genetics of a human being. And the perfect example is an individual in China who a few years ago tried to do exactly what we're talking about. He took a couple of little girls as embryos and tried to do the genetic manipulation. His goal, he said, was to prevent them from ever being infected with the HIV virus. And so he made this change in their genetics while they were embryos and actually gestated them to birth. Nobody supposedly knew he was actually going to do that. He announced it at a big global genetics meeting and was almost uniformly ridiculed for doing it. But let's look at the actual effects on the individual and the potential future of humanity. He wasn't actually able, with his gene editing, to completely prevent them from being infected. His tools were not very well tuned, but also the hubris that, oh, you just have to make a little cut or a change here doesn't affect other parts of the genome. And that is one big problem with this type of gene editing, especially the heritable, that we don't know where else it's making changes. Even in the gene that he supposedly was targeting, yeah, they might have been immune to the HIV virus, but as you started to look at other things that this gene does, he probably made them more susceptible to West Nile virus, to influenza. He probably changed their cognitive abilities and shortened their lifespan. So there are a lot of problems that can come when we have the thought that we know so much and we can do this, and I'm the smart person, I can make it happen. And again, these are heritable changes that are passed on. We have no idea what effects that might have in the future. There is a good side, let me just add, to gene editing if you do it in what's called somatic gene editing. Somatic meaning the body, and we're talking about treating individuals after they're born, or even soon before birth. You can do this now. But it's at a point where you're not changing their whole genome and allowing that to be inherited. Instead, you actually are trying to treat a disease.
It sounds like playing God, and that's never a good strategy. We are not God. We should not. I love the way that you said that. It's as though we're making humans in our image, but that's not our place. God already made us in his image. I think that we would be wise, not to go back to Jurassic Park, but we would be wise not to mess with things that are not ours to mess with. Dr. Prentice, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Well, in speaking with Dr. Prentice, I mean, there were multiple times today where the hair literally stands up on the back of your neck as you hear these things. The Orwellian horrors that could be in store if we violate the sanctity of human life. And that's what this really all goes back to. No matter what we do, no matter what scientific, embryonic advancements that we think that we may be able to come up with in the future, we always have to filter everything that we do to make sure that it is in alignment with the sanctity of human life. And the facts of the case are that, yes, at the very moment of fertilization, you have a new human being, deserving of the right to life and all other protections that we would give to any human being. They're not something to be played with and tested on and altered and mutilated in the name of science. That would be a horrific scientific ethic that I encourage everyone to stay very, very far away from. If you'd like to learn more about the things we've talked about here today, I encourage you to go to our website, lifeissues.org. You'll find more information and resources from Dr. Prentice so that you can share that with your friends, your family members, and your coworkers as we defend life. Again, that's available at lifeissues.org. Be sure to tune in next week for another Straight Talk on Life Issues.
With SRN News, I'm Mary Rose. Forecasters say much of the U.S. is about to get slammed by a major heat wave.
We have a combination of hot temperatures in the 90s to low 100s with high humidity will create heat indices up to 105 to 110 degrees, with overnight temperatures only dropping into the from the mid-70s to the low 80s.
Meteorologist Joe Wegman of the National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center says the southeastern U.S. is already feeling the heat Saturday, soon to spread to the Intermountain West. And the New York Times reporters are subpoenaed after the way they were reported on the president's new Air Force One. Correspondent Julie Walker reports.
The Trump administration subpoenaed several New York Times journalists after their report on security concerns involving the new Air Force One. That's according to the paper. The new jet was a gift to President Trump from Qatar, and it went into service last week. The paper says federal agents showed up at the reporters' homes with subpoenas to force them to testify before a federal grand jury in Manhattan on Wednesday. Trump flew the new Air Force One to a NATO summit in Turkey last week, but he departed on an old Air Force One for England, with the newer jet also coming along. He then switched back to the Qatar plane for the flight home. Julie Walker, New York.
A fast-moving fire continues to burn in northern Los Angeles County. Engineer Jonathan Torres with the L.A. County Fire Department says several hundred people have been told to leave their homes as firefighters battle the wind-driven flames. The fire is burning east of Palmdale and into the Angeles National Forest. In a sparsely populated area, several outbuildings have burned, but no homes that we know of so far. This is SRN News. Should kids be banned from social media?
The Pew Research Center has been asking American adults, and 56% say yes, they would support a ban on social media for anybody under the age of 16. 21% oppose a ban, and the rest of respondents can't make up their mind. The Pew poll also finds strong support for keeping children off social media existing across men and women, young and old, parents and the childless, and both Republicans and Democrats. Michael Harrington reporting.
Malaysia is the latest country to try and protect young people from dangers of the internet. The government has started enforcing rules to prevent children under 16 from having social media accounts. This decision is part of a global effort to enhance safety protections. Existing users under 16 will have a month to manage their data before restrictions apply. Companies that fail to comply face hefty fines. This is SRN News. Actor Anthony Hopkins, he has a new occupation, composer.
The 88-year-old star of movies such as Shadowlands, where he portrayed theologian C.S. Lewis, is releasing an album of orchestral music that he's written over the past 6 decades. In a statement, he says, "I've been composing music all my life. Some of these pieces have lived with me for decades, and I still find myself returning to them." The album of his music on Decca Classics will be performed by Gustavo Dudamel, conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra. Keith Peters reporting.
The European Union accused Meta on Friday of breaching its social media law by designing Facebook and Instagram to get users hooked, and demanded it disable key addictive features like infinite scrolling. The EU's executive arm issued a fresh set of charges against Meta Platforms as part of its investigation. More details at srnnews.com.
Colossians 1, verse 16. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. Colossians 1, verse 16 in God's Word, the Bible, the supremacy of Christ over all things.
Speech on. Selected. Screen recording.